Noah Baerman. I'm wearing two hats tonight. There's the piano hat in a moment, but also I'm here as the artistic director of Resonant Motion, which is a nonprofit based in Middletown, although we've got satellites in a few other locations. And Resonant Motion's mission revolves around music and positive change. Music as a source of uplift and inspiration and education, and the reciprocity of that with these things. So not only music as a vehicle for expressing and enlightening, but also the ways other things in the world can inform and inspire the music itself. And we're happy to be kicking off the 2016 Jazz Up Close series. If you're new to the series, the format will become intuitive. We'll play a tune and then take some questions and engage in dialogue with any of y'all who have anything to ask our guest artist, or I suppose any of us. And the theme of the 2016 series is spanning generations. So we're going to have a lot of age diversity this year. And age and, I guess, as a result, experience diversity. So I'm going to introduce you the musicians one by one. First of all, on the bass, my left-hand man for all of the shows in this series thus far, this is Henry Lugo. On the drums, we have someone who actually is already part of the Resonant Motion family, having recorded on The Unseen River by the great young guitarist Sean Clappis on RMI Records. This is Jay Sawyer. And I'm really delighted for multiple reasons to have our featured guest artist tonight. She's a great player, a great composer, and so much of her music embodies this synergy of music and other aspects of human existence and spirit. Please give a warm Middletown welcome to Caroline Davis.
Thank you, everybody, for such a warm, lovely atmosphere we have here in this beautiful town, and beautiful library. I just have to give it up for this place. I just walked through some of the stacks back here, and it's so lovely to be here. So thank you for having us. We're going to play a couple of my original songs this evening. The first one being about this road. I used to live in Chicago, and there used to be a stretch of jazz clubs on a road there called Lincoln Avenue. Lincoln Avenue still stands in Chicago. It's still a road. If you know Chicago, it's like set up like a grid. So there's streets that run north and south, streets that run east and west. But there's a couple roads that go diagonally, and Lincoln Avenue is one of those roads. So it's a diagonal stretch of road. And many jazz clubs used to be on this road in the 80s and 90s. And we just finished a project that honored all the musicians and clubs and venues and people who were active in that time period in Chicago. So this song is about that road in Chicago that everybody used to kind of hang out on and play on. So it's called Lincoln Land. One, two.
much. So now is the time when you can ask questions of Caroline about, well, I won't say anything because let's keep this dignified, but about that piece, about her music, about her process, her journey, whatever it might be, about things about the music more generally that might have been puzzling to you.
Well, first of all, how did you get started in music?
Well, my dad and mom love listening to like kind of R&B and soul music at home. My parents are European, so my mom's Swedish and my dad's British, but they love, like, when I was a kid, they listened to like Earth, Wind and Fire and Michael Jackson and all those kinds of bands that had horn sections. And so when I got old enough to be involved in music and they were asking us what instrument we wanted to play, I wanted to play the saxophone because I always heard it when I was growing up from my family. So I started when I was like 12 in band, junior high school band. And I played, Hot Cross Buns and like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, all of those pieces. And then I, kind of kept going and I kept going, and I really love it. It's such an incredible gift to be able to share music with people, and I think it's something that you can't really explain. It's just more of like a thing that's out there floating in the world, and I always wanted to, be able to do that for people and with people.
Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Do you have a process for like writing music?
For writing?
Process for writing music.
You're asking about my process. That's such a complicated, everything is all the pieces are so different. But for this piece, I would say, I had in mind that I wanted to honor that scene in Chicago, and I just I interviewed about 15 people who were like around in the 80s and 90s in Chicago, and I just listened to them talking about this area of town over and over, just listening with the headphones. And this melody kind of just like came to me, but it came from the bass line. And so I started with the bass line. And because I play a melodic instrument, I can't play more than one note at a time, on this. So I tend to think about the two voices, the bass and the melody first, and then I kind of fill in the peanut butter and jelly or what. I think about like the two tops and bottom of the sandwich first, and then I fill in that stuff. So it really came from the melody and the bass, and that's usually how I work with melody and bass, because that's what I hear in my head. And I'm not the best piano player. I can play a little bit, but very slowly. So that was for that. And then like this next piece we're gonna play, for example, it's about a gentleman who I never met, but who's had a really tough existence because he was a jazz musician living in the 70s and 80s, and he had a really bad drug addiction, and so but he was also a very beautiful person, and so I listened to a bunch of recordings of him talking, and I listened to his music, and the melody that I wrote came out of his music. So there were little aspects of his saxophone playing that I kind of like pulled, and sometimes I'll take those aspects and I'll practice them forwards and backwards, and sometimes what comes out, the backwards thing, is what I end up writing. But because nobody could really, in a way, I'm like borrowing. We're like always borrowing material from other people, and so that's one thing that I like to do. But I'm telling you how I steal other people's things. But I don't think there's any shame in that, because I think music has to come from somewhere, So, yeah.
I wonder if you could tell me about your instrument. It looks a little aged.
Oh yeah, it's aged. Yeah, this is a Sawyer saxophone from the 1954, and actually, it's funny because this is it's in really good shape because the lacquer, which is the shiny part, is still pretty much on the whole horn except the bell. Whoever had my instrument before wanted to darken. I like a dark sound, so they they stripped the lacquer, the shiny part, from the bell, and so that's why that part of it looks even more old. But it's just that they took probably some like oven cleaner or something and like took off the shiny part. So, but yeah, I found it in Texas because that's where my mom's living right now, and I was always looking for one of these instruments. It's a very famous model, the Mark VI Selmer, and most people think they're the best saxophone that Selmer ever made. They're still making saxophones, but they say that this is like the best, and I believe that too. And so I was looking for one, for about 6 months I was traveling all around the world to visit family and friends in different parts of the US, and everywhere I went I would look for the Selmer Mark VI, and I found this in Texas, and it turns out that the guy who was selling it was a friend of my high school band director's. So he knocked off almost $1,000 from the price, which is pretty rare. So yeah, I'm very lucky to have this instrument. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, how do you go about developing the drum line, the percussion line, or is it, do you add it, does the drummer, or does someone come in and help sort of, figure that out?
Well, most of the time, I just find people who are good enough to just do it, and I don't have to say anything. But no, I think I have an idea of the groove that I want, and sometimes I'll just sing it to him, and then he'll just play different things, and I'll say, no, that's not it, or yes, that's it, and go in this direction. And then mostly, I think I tend to choose musicians who are kind of on the same line as me, and so I don't really have to do very much. It's just the person. It's more the person than what they're actually playing.
Yeah, so some of that was ad-libbing, clearly, but some of that was,
Yeah.
he was taking some instruction off of the,
Yeah.
something sheet or whatnot.
Yeah, she told me it was like an Afro-Peruvian type thing, and I kind of take a look at that. And, we're playing music, it's jazz, so that's the influence. And I have that influence, and I kind of put those two things together, and that's what I came up with.
I think in a lot of cases, I'm not a drummer, but as someone who also has to deal with writing stuff that a drummer is going to play, a lot of it is in that in-between place of improvised versus written, in the sense that, like on this tune, even if the drum part isn't fully written out, Caroline wrote these really specific rhythms that are built into the song itself, and it's the job of a good drummer to figure out something that will fit those rhythms. So that's not entirely unlike having a not completely scripted conversation about a strictly delineated set of topics. So if you've got more questions, contemplate them, hold on to them for a moment, and let's play them.
Yeah, so like I said, this piece is called Lynn, and it was written for this tenor saxophone player who used to live in Chicago. He's passed now, but his name was Lynn Halliday, and he was a very troubled individual, and everyone who I talked to about him seemed to say the same sorts of things, like he had a hard time waking up in the morning, and he was on the methadone program, and there's so many things about this person, and I love his sound, his tone, and he was relatively unknown, but he just had such a gift, and I wanted to honor him through this song. So. people who have been around for hundreds of years, like Charlie Parker is a big influence of mine, of course, and Sonny Rollins, and Lynn Halliday, who's a really incredible musician who I just mentioned. Let's see, Kenny Garrett, who's a great saxophone player, and some people today, like Dick Oates, or there's a really great tenor saxophone player in North Carolina named Stephen Riley, who I really like. And some other people in New York who I've been checking out, Bill McHenry. But I do listen to a lot of older saxophone players, and one of my main influences is Lee Konitz, who's still alive today. And I just love his phrasing and his time, his sound, and the way he plays unconventional things. So those are probably the main people. And I do listen to other instruments too. I like James Williams on the piano, Kenny Kirkland. There's a bunch of people I'm not naming right now. Branford Marsalis is another saxophone player who I really like. I like his ability to build a solo, Branford Marsalis. I don't know. That's a lot of people, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, other questions? No pressure, yes.
So my buddy and I go to Newport Jazz every year.
Oh, yeah.
How do you get on the invite list?
How do you're asking
How
me
does
how
a
I...
musician get on the invite
Oh,
list?
how does a musician get on? I don't know. I wish, if you can tell me, I would love to know. I don't know. You mean to get on the invite list
Have
to
you
play
done
there?
festivals?
Well, oh yeah, I've played a lot of festivals for sure. Not Newport. I don't know George Wine. I mean, he's the person
Yeah.
who puts the festival together, so I don't know him. And I feel like the best way to go about getting those gigs is to know the right people. And so that's how I've been able to get on those bigger festivals is I know somebody who can introduce me to George Wine, for example. Or I know someone who has played that festival before and maybe they can put a band together that I'm in, So I think that's the best strategy for getting those gigs. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. You can just send your CD in, but the chances of them listening to it are pretty slim, unless they know you, So yeah, I think that's the best way to do it. You guys would probably know better than me.
I've never even been to Newport as a spectator, so I'm
I know. I've been once, and it's quite an amazing festival. The location and everything, it's beautiful.
Okay, Chris.
Since these are all like classical instruments, do you think it's important to have like a background in classical music or at least some technique stuff?
Well, yeah, I think technique is, of course, having a background, learning how to play the instrument. But I think there's plenty of technicians who don't have a background in classical music, I think that's one aspect of music that is important. And I think if you're going to be a musician for your whole life, then you should probably check it out, at one point. But I don't think it's like necessary, I think there are plenty of musicians who have their range of influences, and maybe classical music isn't one of them, But I certainly am influenced by it, and I listen to a lot, for example, of Bach's music, because I think it helps with harmony. Like learning classical music is helpful with learning the structure of harmony for me, and that's how I think I learned most about harmony, is through classical music. I don't know. What do you guys think? It's pretty, yeah.
I tend to agree with you. This may be heresy, but I think, this is an instrument where it's assumed that you need classical technique just to be proficient enough to play anything. And my perception is that European classical music, which is an important distinction because, of course, there's classical music in India and Indonesia and all sorts of other places that have nothing to do with Europe.
Right.
But the idea that I think it's more just that that's the tradition that commonly is used and that exists with a codified method of how to become proficient on this instrument. And it's not to say that there couldn't be an equally valid way of developing the ability to get around the instrument without that stylistic point of reference. But that's the one that's sort of the gold standard, and so people tend to go with that. But there are certainly non-classically trained virtuosi.
Yeah.
It largely depends on what you're trying to communicate on an instrument, I find.
Right.
I mean, I was thinking about Muddy Waters and how you can't listen to the old, well, I mean, I suppose you could. It's hard for me to listen to the great old blues guys and think, yeah, well, that would be pretty good if he checked out some more classical technique. It's just not relevant to that music, and in fact, that kind of precision and at times rigidity would not necessarily help the music. But there are other things where it becomes useful.
Yeah.
She could have answered your question by saying, to which are you referring to?
Oh, right. That's
You know,
true.
because you're referring to European classical music.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're playing American classical music.
Oh yeah.
That's true.
By the definition, if I'm not putting words in your mouth, that classical music is not something specifically associated with Europe in bygone centuries. It refers to music that is considered to be high culture and that requires a great deal of training and a sort of apprenticeship process of learning things inside and out in order to achieve this expression and proficiency in this high art form. And so jazz certainly fits all of those criteria,
Yeah.
with all due respect to Mozart. Yes?
So, in the beginning in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, my understanding is most musicians came up through the street or through clubs, and that was a really valid way of learning to make music, and some incredible music was created that way. And now it seems that the path is through more formal study and education and music school. And I look at those two aspects of it, and I also look at the popularity of jazz, and I look at the music that's being created, and I kind of say, what's going on here? Is this a good thing or not a good thing? And where is this taking it? Where's the direction of this formal training taking the music?
That's a great question. I think it's a great question. I think it's something that we're all, as young musicians, we're all facing that. And personally, I don't have a degree in music performance. I studied psychology in college, so I completely agree with you in that I don't really, no offense to anybody up here, but I don't really think it's necessary to go to school to get an education in jazz, for example. And I feel like everything I learned on this instrument and from people has been through me contacting them and asking them for lessons, or paying them privately for lessons, or listening to all of the recordings, because as you said, it came from this passing down of knowledge. It's kind of like a little apprentice system in its own right, because we pass down the licks from generation to generation. We all play the same songs from generation to generation. Everyone knows how to play the blues and rhythm changes. And this system of codifying that is, I think it is slightly damaging. I do think it's slightly damaging. And I wish it weren't like that, honestly, because I can see the direction of the music. Like you said, there's some direction of music but there are a lot of people who are doing it the other way, I think, who are learning by way of their masters, or they're learning a little bit from their jazz education in school, and they take that with them, but they don't let that rule their lives, They take a handful from professors who have taught them. And these days, because jazz, the popularity, I feel like the popularity of jazz is kind of in an upsurge right now, personally. But some people say that it's not, and I think a lot of masters of jazz, elder statesmen, are teaching at universities, and that's really helping, I think, some musicians. Like Jay studied with Billy Hart, who's one of the best drummers alive right now, and who's, how old is he? Like in his 80s, right?
Yeah.
And it's because he went to that university that he was teaching at. And I think that is one great thing about choosing a college to study jazz is if you have a teacher, let's say you want to study with Ron Carter, the bass player, you know, maybe you'll apply to go to Juilliard because he teaches there. And I think that's one thing that the younger musicians are missing, is to pinpoint the teacher you want to study with and see if they teach at a university and then go there for that reason, instead of just going there to get a general education in jazz. Because I don't know if that is helping your direction for where you want to go, you know.
So, it just listening to you just made me think of something else. Under the surface, for musicians today on a subconscious level, I think there's this element of financial security or personal security, making a living. And I think back in the 40s and 50s, and it was a much freer time. And I think my sense is musicians didn't have to deal, that wasn't as much of a factor in their life, and they were freer because of that. And is that reflected, do you think, in the music? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Because
So the
music,
university route is a safer,
yeah,
there's less risk versus the other way, old
Yeah.
school.
Do you mean the university route of studying in one? Or?
Yeah, study through
because
that.
then you're prepared to be able to then teach at another university and you
Right,
have financial security
right,
for that.
right.
Yeah, I mean, I talk to my friends about this all the time because we're constantly scraping together opportunities for us to make money, and some of those are private parties, some of those are weddings. I think because as a jazz musician, and I'm not saying jazz is better than any form of other music, but I find that I can go and play in many different situations. So like I can play in a rock band, or I can play in a more trad jazz situation, or I can play in a big band, or I can play with a singer-songwriter because I can play flute and maybe they want flute, or I can go and record for my friend who does advertising commercials because I can just hear what they want me to play and play it in 5 seconds, and they don't want to sit for an hour and wait for me to figure it out while they're paying for studio time. So I think that's one good way, because we work very quickly, jazz musicians, in my opinion, because there's so much that we've learned by ear, you know, and then that process helps us in other situations. And I think there are plenty of other musicians in like R&B and rock who can do the same thing. So I'm not saying jazz is any better, but I've heard. What was the original question? Now?
Well, it's the contrast between
Oh right.
not worrying about what tomorrow's going to bring and not worrying about having health insurance. And,
Well, yeah.
and making it to the gig.
A lot has changed.
Honestly, I think, well, honestly, I'm sorry, but I just want to say that I think that even my idols who are no longer living had problems with money too. I mean, Charlie Parker had to pawn his horn time after time after time to get the money in order to eat, or maybe he was using it for substances. But anyway, he had to do that. And so, and Sonny Rollins talks about how he barely had enough. I feel like this has been a struggle for many musicians throughout history. But it is, I mean, you are bringing up a very good point. And I do think it is good to learn how to educate people, and it's good to learn how to teach lessons, because I have to teach a little bit in order to make it work, because I play saxophone and I wouldn't get hired as much as a bass player would, because we need bass players. But we don't necessarily need, you know, saxophone is, you can have a trio, anyway, you understand what I'm saying. But I think it's very important to learn the skills to teach. I think that is an important thing, and so there is some merit and there is some value in going to like a school to learn how to do that, you know. But I don't think it's the right way to learn how to play this music, honestly. I just don't. It's just my opinion. So, you were gonna say?
No, it's an oral tradition, so
Yeah.
it's passed down that way. It's best, I think it's best learned that way as well.
Yeah, and I think there's some, like, I know some university teachers who were teaching at university who helped me learn how to transcribe. Like, how do you transcribe? Do you just listen to the music and you just automatically figure it out on your instrument? How do you do that? And I think some of those people helped me to learn how to do that, or some of these people pointed me in the right direction. Don't transcribe that Charlie Parker solo because it's too hard for you at this level. Instead, why don't you check out this Jackie McLean solo from this period of Jackie's life, because he was very clear, and you can learn how to do this, but the bird stuff is like a little too hard for you. And that part of it I think is helpful, you know, to have those even lists of like the best 100 best recordings or something, you know. And I also know from friends who went to SUNY Purchase in White Plains, they studied with Kenny Washington, who's a great drummer, and he was one of the smartest men I know in terms of like knowing the history of the music. And he made his students learn, like, he would drop the needle and he would ask, who is playing on this recording? And he would kind of like force that process via tests and quizzes and stuff like that. And I think that is an incredible way to teach, and that's like such a valuable way to teach in a university, and I think it's few and far between, but that's an example of something that I think is great at a college level, for someone to come into the classroom and do it like that, you know, instead of opening a book and telling them to read about, you know, Big Spiderbeck, when you could actually play a recording and talk about that instead, or listen, just spend the class listening instead of talking, you know. So anyway.
Yeah. I feel that the analogy came to my mind of a supermarket.
Yeah.
In the sense that the advantage of a supermarket is you can get everything you need in one place. So the things a jazz musician, a budding jazz musician needs to do now are all pretty much the same as they were 50 years ago. I mean, aside from learning how to tweet or whatever, but the things actually about playing the music are the same. And it just used to be you had to go to a lot more different places to get them. And some universities are really well set up to provide you the same kind of authentic learning experience that you would get elsewhere, only in one place in a sort of systematized way, and others less so. You know, anytime you try to commodify something, every time you try to turn it into something that is a system in place that churns things out, it's gonna work for some people, and in other cases it's gonna be only as good as the individual they get doing this particular job. I mean, I was lucky that where I went to school, it was a small program with a lot of people who I felt taught in a very organic and unencumbered way. So it was not, you know, I got to hang out with Kenny Baerman for an hour every week, and I didn't.
Or Jackie McLean too. Like
right, they're not necessarily operating under the same kind of pressure to follow a curriculum. It's just you get to hang out with and learn from master musician elders.
I think that's so lucky. That's a lucky situation, or Jay's situation, you know.
Yeah. And you know, the converse is also true. I mean, just because you learn it on the streets doesn't mean you're getting the information you need or in a way that's useful. But yeah, but it is an interesting thing. It's funny, and this is not at all criticizing the question, but it's funny that for me to think of characterizing going to music school as something that's a greater source of security, because you know, everybody now has to deal with the issue of, okay, to what extent does the debt I'm leaving school with balance out with the skills that I'm now equipped with?
No extent.
Right. And there is
It's not just music too right now.
And it's not just
No.
music. And I think
Yeah.
when Jay was saying a lot has changed, you know, the whole economy of, I mean, of our society and of music specifically has changed. So it's kind of hard to evaluate how stupid it is to be a jazz musician right now from a financial standpoint, because all of the things we would use as our points of reference have changed. I know every year I have to recalibrate whether it's ethically appropriate for me to tell a young musician that he or she should pursue music as a career or go to a conservatory. And in the end, I keep coming up with the same answers I did 10 or 15 years ago, because it may be a more questionable thing, but everything else is too. You know, and if I view it kind of like, forgive me if you've heard this spiel before, but I view it kind of like the clergy, where if it's your calling, then you obey it and you figure out how to make it work. And if it isn't your calling, it's probably a really stupid idea. You know, like, you don't look at musician or like Presbyterian minister on a list of emerging fields and then go into that accordingly. You know, you only do it if it's what you have to do, and then you kind of obey that calling, whatever, and make it work however you can.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. I think it does work for some people, and it doesn't work for others, right? The problem I think happens when you get those cookie cutter, you know, you have a bunch of people and they're kind of churned out and they're all the same. They sound all the same, but jazz is an individual expression of yourself, so it should be anti that, you know, it should be like, you find what works for you, right? Like Noah said, you know, but I think I've been seeing lately, there's so many people that come out and they sound all the same, and that's frustrating, you know, for me as a musician. Good question.
I think we're going to play one more tune.
Right.
And we're approachable people, so if you think of a brilliant question afterwards, you can come talk to us. I would ask that you keep in mind that Caroline has a selection of CDs available that are wonderful and available back there, right near the punch bowl, which is perhaps going to be filled with cash money by the time, right? We'll see. But I will say that we are extraordinarily grateful to the Middletown Commission on the Arts for helping to subsidize this. So we really appreciate their support. It's making this series possible. There are costs that go beyond that, and if you feel it is a free event, so feel no obligation, but if you feel some combination of inspired by what you're experiencing and excited by the 3 shows remaining in the series this year and burdened by the thickness of your wallet, we have solutions to all of those things in that very punch bowl. So, Caroline, why don't you tell us about this last tune?
One of my biggest influences in Chicago was a saxophone player named Bon Freeman, who passed away probably 4 years now. And I would go and see him every week. He had a jam session and a performance that he would do every week in this bar called the New Apartment Lounge. And afterwards, after his set was over, he would always say, "Where are my horses at?" And which just means like, where are all of the young jazz musicians like chomping at the bit, wanting to play, you know. So I wrote this song for him, and it's called "For the Horses," which are all the younger jazz musicians who always came to the New Apartment Lounge. And it's like a very academic way of writing a piece of music, but basically, so "Where my horse is at" is like it's 5 syllables in that phrase, and so I just kind of took those. I actually had a recording of him saying that phrase, and I took the melody of that phrase and I turned it into a piece of music, basically. And so the whole piece is based around this one statement that he would used to say. So, this is for Von Freeman.
thank you so much for your support. Stay tuned for the next one in June.
Give it up for Noah Baerman.